Hi, welcome to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the film series with lively discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach cinema studies at the College of Staten Island of the City University of New York. Today, it's our pleasure to continue our survey of African cinema. We'll be looking at a 1972 production from Angola, Sarah Maldoror's Sambizanga. This is a story made during the liberation movement of Angolan from Portuguese control. And it, in fact, is about that whole process itself. And it's about a lot more, about the place of women in the revolution and about the forces of oppression in virtually any authoritarian state. We'll have a chance to chat about those issues and others after today's screening with today's guest. It's a pleasure to welcome back to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, Professor Edna Aizenberg of Marymount Manhattan College. Now, check out, take a look at Sambizanga. Hi, welcome back to Cinema Then, Cinema Now. I hope you've enjoyed what I think is an extremely rare opportunity to see Sarah Maldoror's Sambizanga. It's a film that comes from a particular historical moment. It has particular purposes, and we have 30 minutes to chat about that and some other things. Let me take this moment, however, to introduce today's guest. It's a pleasure to have back on Cinema Then, Cinema Now, Professor Edna Aizenberg. Edna is a professor of Latin American, African, and comparative literature at Marymount Manhattan College. She's written a great deal, as a matter of fact, on African literature, a number of African writers, including the very well-known Chinua Achebe. She is currently completing a comparative study of contemporary Latin American and African narrative. Edna, let's start with a little bit of history, a little bit of a history lesson in one sense. This film comes from 1972. The 60s and the 70s are very much a distinct period in African history.
Absolutely.
Set that up for us a little bit and the kind of context of what's coming out of storytelling in Africa in that era.
Okay, I'll be happy to. First of all, it's a pleasure to be back here
great.
again, talking about African cinema this time. And I think Achebe, who you just mentioned a moment ago, might be a good place to start answering this question.
Great Nigerian novelist.
Right. He has an essay called "The Novelist as Teacher," and I think that indicates exactly the position of many writers in this period, pre-independence, independence, and perhaps immediately post-independence, where novelists and artists in general felt that art, literature, cinema had to be part of a nation-building project. And I think that's very clear in the film.
Yes, indeed.
Where art is applied to the project of liberation, in this case of Angola, of a Portuguese colony.
And this is an era in which virtually all the countries that we now think of as the nation states of Africa are born. In one way or another, they go through the process of separation from those colonial powers who had controlled them for anywhere from 50 to 200 years.
Well, we have to remember the Portuguese were among the first colonialists in Africa, so you have a long colonial history in Portugal. On the part of Portugal in Africa. And in one way or another, every African former colony moving into nation had to define an identity or a number of identities in order to build a nation. Many of the African nation states were artificial creations a result of colonialist decisions rather than, than what was actually happening in the place itself.
I think it's a point worth dwelling on for a second, that one of the things meant by the process of colonialization, which took place, I mean, not exclusively, but largely the scramble was a 19th century scramble to carve up Africa, was a matter of a set of boundaries that were established by conquest and by agreement among European nations that in no way corresponded to the necessary traditional definitions of boundaries as they had been developed by the various peoples of Africa. So then, years later, when the nation states are formed, they're formed in many ways according to those boundaries that had been set up by the colonial powers. So you have living within countries groups of people who, if this were 500 years ago, would have never grouped themselves together. Whatever their relations among one another were, they would not have grouped themselves together, and they've been thrown into this thing called Angola, or this thing called
and I
Senegal.
Think much of the conflicts that ensued after independence, which this film doesn't show, this is a pre-independence film, but much of the conflict that ensued after independence, the Biafran conflict, for instance, in Nigeria and other areas, was precisely a result of this artificial boundary making. So the whole question of building a nation, building an imaginary community, to use that term, is very important. And I think that this film then illustrates for us how art worked to achieve that nation-building project. And to go back to Achebe, in his essay called The Novelist as Teacher, he says, we should not be ashamed of this. We should not feel that we have to do some sort of European or universalist kind of writing or filmmaking where a message is bad, but we have to do something that is needed at this particular time in this particular society. Well,
you make me think of two other artists who've taken stances like that, and some of this actually comes back to your comparative work. Osman Simben, whom we have seen we've seen one of his films in this series. We'll see another one, talked about the process of coming to filmmaking as the films that they can make could be a kind of night school for the nations, because this was a way in which people after work or in a community center, if they had access to the films would not merely fill time, they would not be just entertainment as our kinds of industrial societies frequently brag about their things, but rather that this would be part of this process. The writer you have also written very, very well on, and who has been a concern of other series here, and who shares many concerns with these artists, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, in interviews has talked about the fact that he's always amazed by the role that artists do not play in European or North American society, because artists from Latin America or from Africa have a real stake in the education and the nation building.
And I think that's an extremely important point, that the role of the artist in, and I hate to use the term third world with all the changes that have occurred. It's a problematic term, but let's use it as a shorthand. We'll use it as a shorthand. Okay. The role of the artist in the third world is often quite different from that in Europe or in North America. And why should it be the same? Why should we expect, as Garcia Marquez and others, and Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the Kenyan writers, and many, many others have said, why should the role be the same? The role of the artist is a function of the society in which the artist works and writes.
And this is all, I think you bring up an excellent point, because this is all part of the process of separation from colonialism, because the artist has a certain function, a certain place in the societies that created colonialism, and if the people who are struggling against colonialism, who are part of the liberation, assume that their artists had the same role, well, what would be the point?
This is a much debated issue in Africa. What is the role of the artist? And okay, the artist as teacher, but then where does art come in? And does being a teacher conflict with art.
Right.
I think this movie works very well on both fronts.
Oh, yes.
I think we have the artist as teacher, and it has a very interesting blend of teaching, if I could call it that, the message and the use of art forms, the incorporation of art forms, many of which are Angolan, are African, and I think the filmmaker has done an excellent job in doing that for us.
I think so. Now, one interesting point I think to bring up as we move closer to actually discussing this film is that this is a film that was made in an historical moment in which Angola had not fully separated itself. I mean,
yes.
This is a partisan film. From our audience's point of view, this film is as partisan as we would expect an American film to be made in the midst of World War II. Yes. We may regret the portrayal of the other side when historical conditions change and shift, but at a particular moment, a particular kind of rhetoric, a particular kind of way of addressing the subject is the historically appropriate kind of way.
Absolutely, and I think part of the project of nation building, which we just alluded to a moment ago, was the recuperation and the creation of art forms, whether it meant recreating the past, which is, of course, one of the things that African literature and African cinema has done consistently, whether it meant talking about the present moment, which I think this particular film does, and whether it means projecting into the future. But you have to create art forms that are appropriate to your milieu and appropriate to what you're trying to say, even if they're partisan.
No. And one of the things that African artists and other third world artists talk about is the way in which in the West certain arguments tend to be universalized.
Right.
The assumption that the conditions that pertain to artists in certain societies are identical to other societies, and that somehow we all share the same history with a capital H, that there's a universalizing history, as opposed to the notion that there are many histories and many voices of those histories, and not all of those voices or all of those histories have been equally heard, equally articulated, equally distributed.
Well, history is, of course, a major point here. And usually when history was talked about with a capital H, it was European history.
Right.
So that this is part of the reason for the emphasis on particular histories and on particular languages and on particular moments and on particular social issues. Because universalizing has usually worked to the detriment of everyone else.
Yes. See, the universal is, as it were,
it's a very particular universal, is what I'm saying. It's a very particular universal.
Yeah, very well. The problem with the universal is that
it's really particular. Okay, so
very good point.
So when you say, well, it's so narrow, they're focusing in on only this particular thing. Why don't they talk about large issues? Well, who defines what large issues are?
Yeah, a point very well taken. Now, there's a parallel in many ways in this film between another one of the films we've already seen in the series, and that is Black Girl by Ousmane Sembène.
Right.
Now, Ousmane Sembène's Black Girl takes place in the neo-colonial period after the separation. I mean, it's Senegalese. It's the story of a young woman who comes to the south of France as a servant and eventually commits suicide there, after it is revealed to her what her true conditions are. Now, one of the things that is so unusual about the film, and so moving, stunning, etc., is that its focus is on the previously marginalized. That is, we experience the story of Black Girl through the eyes, the ears, and the thoughts of the Senegalese woman who is hired as a domestic. Now, I'm interested in Sambizanga over the fact of who it chooses as its characters. That is, There's a whole range of characters in the film, but it chooses particular kinds of characters as its as who it should be. Now, why do you think these kinds of characters are chosen?
Well, I think on one level, these characters, of course, are the carriers of the message of
Yes.
the movie, which is quite obvious. But you have types.
Yeah.
You have types. You have the heroic worker.
Right.
You have the long-suffering wife, but I don't want to leave it just at the long-suffering
No.
wife, because I think that what is interesting is not so much the characters as types, although it's definitely there. The heroic worker, the suffering wife, the sage, the elderly man who's a sage. In other words, there are a number of types. The mother, the
Right.
revolutionary, you have types, but I think just as interesting as the types is what happens to these types as they rise in consciousness. And the woman here
Okay.
plays a very important function. How could I leave out the women?
I had no idea you were not going to do that. I was really
This film was
confident.
made by a woman, so you know, of course, that we have to keep in mind. But I think that it's interesting that while the movie, the heroic figure as such is the worker, Domingos Javier,
Right.
It's his wife who plays as important a role
Oh, very.
in what is going on in the movie, in the search for her husband, in the resistance to the
Yes.
colonialist authority, in the mobilizing of the community. So that the types are there, but the types, I think, are worked on in such a way as that they rise beyond just being stock figures.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. You and I were chatting a little bit before
Yes.
we actually came on camera over the fact that a cinema like this can be a little bit distant to Western viewers on certain grounds. One, that it is so interested in the particular. And if it's a particular that you don't know so much about, you say, oh, and this is really a writing of history, an attempt directly at writing the history of not only what is happening, but what should be happening with other people themselves. So that's perhaps a little bit off-putting to some people if they don't understand that this comes out of a particular set of historical conditions. Second point, though, is about characters and about starting with types. Now, in American genre film, we use types as well of stock villains, stock heroines, etc. But when they are further individualized, they're usually individualized on psychological terms.
Yeah.
That is, they have certain characteristics of individuality that is psychologically defined in some ways. And in some sense, we think of complexity of character or function. I mean, quantitatively, that's what we experience most as being this product of individuality and psychology. That's really rather different from the notion of what growing in consciousness means in a film like Sambizanga, because it's not becoming more yourself as an individual. It's becoming more yourself as a people.
Right, but I think we go again to the context.
Right.
You know, why should an African film function in the same way as an American film does?
I don't think it should.
I'm not saying you do, but I think very often, inevitably, we bring our own cultural habits to viewing something which is from another culture. But I'm making this point in the sense that what is important here is the community. The individual functions within a community. And therefore, this kind of psychological growth, if you will,
Right.
or soul searching, or the little voice inside of you, can't work the same way, nor should it, because the individual is an integral part of the community. And the scene in this movie, which I love, which I think really drives this home so well, is that scene where the husband is grabbed,
Right.
and he's taken away in the Land Rover, and he's tied up,
Yes.
and the filmmaker cuts between his being in the truck, in the Land Rover, tied up, and the hostile soldiers, who, by the way, are his own people.
A very strong point about
right,
the film.
who you know, and he's there, and they're sitting around him, and there's no contact. There's hostility. He's tied up like an animal, and the film cuts back and forth. The wife, in the meanwhile, is surrounded by the women of the community who comfort her, who sing to her, who share in the experience. So she's undergoing this as an individual. It's her husband who's been taken, but the community there is part of what's going on as well.
And if I can just further a point that you're making, I think that comes back to part of the importance of this film as a film being made by a woman about this particular contest, because not only is this intercutting between these two things, about an intercutting between the historically just cause and the historically unjust cause, colonialism versus a self-determined people, but it's also about a core set of values that defines either side. And of course, Maldoror goes out of her way to see those values as coming out of a pattern of behavior among the women of these communities. So it's a grounding in a set of values.
No, absolutely. But even though, you know, the film is partisan, I think we should also point out that the cause of the man's imprisonment and his subsequent beating to death is really what the Portuguese interrogators are interested in, is who is the white man who helps you. In other words, this is yes, it's anti-colonialist.
Yes.
And there's a community, but the community can be broadened. The community can be broadened to include what you stand for.
Oh, a very important point, because this, and that's actually a contrast between some of the, again, whether we call them propaganda films or rhetorical films, that I think everybody has seen that has come from the West in particular moments of stress. I mean, World War II or something of this. But this film goes out of its way on both sides to show both African complicity with the colonial powers themselves, and also to show how complicated the racial politics are on both sides.
I think that's an essential point, and I think that shows the subtlety of the film. For me, I see it as a very subtle, a very complex commentary on the situation, even though it does take sides, no question about it.
No, but subtlety and complexity are not inherently in conflict with partisanship.
We agree.
Again,
we agree.
Right. We should be but that's also the notion that everything should, if it's complex, it has to be balanced. A false assumption, but it's an assumption, by the way, very much enforced in the West by notions of, for example, balanced journalism, that everything has to come out in exactly this way, you know.
Well, we know that it never does.
Yes, I know.
So maybe a movie like this, in some ways, is much more honest.
Well, that's, gosh, I agree again, but I think that's the point to come to, that you know exactly, the terms of what they stand for are clear, and it's offered to the spectators to persuade them, but ultimately it's the spectator who decides.
Yes, I agree with you there.
A movie is not a group of men with clubs. Okay?
No.
It is an offering in some way, like all works of art, and one has a decision to make about that offering.
And I think the filmmaker, lets you get into the various manifestations of what is going on in the society, in a society dominated by a colonial power. In other words, it's not one-sided. It's not the heroic workers struggling. It's not the Marxist ideologues discussing Marxist ideology. I think she lets you see how it permeates all types of relationships, all levels of the society, and various responses.
Yes.
Various responses to this, from collaboration to ignoring this and going on, trying to ignore going on with your life, to subtle sabotage, to just kind of watching, observing, keeping an eye, letting somebody know what's going on. So you see this all across the board.
And I think there's a way in which that, the complexity that unfolds in that way in portraying how these forces are deployed and why is it so hard to get rid of the forces? I mean, if it were such a simple universe, then somebody should be able to get the right magic wand and wave it. Now, one mark of that you've already talked about, and really becomes up at the very beginning of the film, where the issue of the debate over what relationship you have with a white is introduced in the first scene. And, you know, if you wanted to write this film instead of as a distinguished piece of revolutionary filmmaking, as a rather predictable melodrama, you would say, well, aha, doesn't he know he shouldn't trust that man, and that man will betray him later in the film? And, of course, the film unfolds in ways that we don't, you know, it's much later in the film that it's revealed that it is that man who has in fact been the collaborator with the resistance side, and that if anything, the relationship, because of the death, has been forged as stronger, not weaker, but stronger.
Absolutely.
In those ways.
One thing that struck me about the film as well is the subtlety with which themes and personalities are developed. The whole notion of revolutionary struggle, again, you're not beat over the head with it. It's hinted at. It's hinted at. You almost have to watch very carefully in the beginning in order not to miss it. And as you say, only at the end does everything unfold and the picture, the brutality sort of grows and the picture becomes clearer. So she works in very subtle ways, I think.
I think that brings up a point I'd like to discuss just for a second about the plotting of the film, because it's one of the traditional means of narrative, but particularly well developed in film, is of parallel plots, of cutting back and forth. For a large segment of this film, we really have three things going on. We are following the husband, but less and less at a number of points. And then we're following the wife, and we're following this set of characters themselves. And for a long portion of the film, in the way the plotting works, these two groups of people that are working to help the husband don't meet each other. They don't even know they exist. It's very late in the film, when the wife arrives at the right jail, that the young boy recognizes and says, oh, somebody else has arrived, and goes off. And you see another answer. Why is it so difficult? Because it's difficult in this environment to communicate between all the parties who should be interested.
And I think you see there, part of this is just the difficulties of life. How does the wife get to the city, to the town, and then subsequently to Luanda, the walk? And the walk is, of course, the symbolic walk with the song, you know, the Camino de Morte, the road of death. And so the difficulties in communication are part just the difficulties of underdevelopment, which I think is part of the colonial enterprise as well.
Now, you bring up another point. We've been emphasizing the rhetorical or persuasive aspects of this narrative, but I find there to be another, among the many other values in the film, one of those great values is in the way it adopts a certain realist set of some conventions. In doing so, we really see a simulated Angola, because it
wasn't filmed in Angola.
It was filmed in the Congo, because they
absolutely.
There was this problem that the Portuguese
the Portuguese were not really very happy about this.
They were not enthusiastic about this production at this particular moment. There was no, and the special fund from Lisbon.
No award. No award
at the Lisbon Film Festival this. Well, so there is the simple material reality that we are given access to, and then we see how messages are passed. We see how difficult it is to get from one place to another if you're of a particular socioeconomic class. I must universalize myself for a second and say the portrayal of levels of bureaucracy within, whether you call it a third world or an undeveloped country or whatever, and the simple difficulty of getting information, not even if it's crucial information, just if it's information you need, is dramatized so well. I think it's one of the reasons it makes this film very, very popular with anybody who's ever had that kind
the
of...
difficulties, yeah. And at the same time, I think the communication networks are slow,
Yes.
are difficult, and yet the communication is there constantly at the pace at which it can operate.
Yes.
And at the pace at which the community, and I'd like to go back for a moment to this question of community, at the pace at which the community can transmit the information and perhaps sometimes chooses to transmit the information. So that I think both things are working there very, in very interesting ways.
Well, that has to do also with the fact that the pacing is, in this film, is quite different, even though technically the plot mechanisms are such that might define a thriller. Okay? I mean, a political kidnapping, the search for, etc. This is not a film that's far more interested in an education about this process and its effects than it is in building suspense over whether they're going to get into the jail.
That's right. That's right. And I think you find that in many African movies.
Yes.
The question of pace, which I think is quite different from the pace that we're used to as Western viewers,
right,
where the faster is the better. At least in the popular film. And here the narrative takes its time.
Well,
takes its time to develop.
You know what time we've taken? We've taken up our time, Edna. I guess we were moving at a Western.
What pace are we?
Pretty Western, pretty fast. If you'd like a bibliography of some key books on African cinema in English, drop us a line. Drop it to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, New York, 10314. Let me give you that information again. Drop it to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, New York, 10314. Edna, this has been an extraordinarily fast-paced 30 minutes for me. Thank you for joining us and bringing with you your expertise on things African, colonial, Lusophonic, etc., etc.
Thanks again for having me. A
Great.
pleasure.
Well, and as always, I hope that our thought and discussion here lead you to thought and discussion at home that you enjoy. Thanks for joining us.